Greetings, students. Michael Siberian here, and this is going to be our lecture on progressivism. I'm going to get to the share screen in just a moment. So here we go. Share screen 2. So when we look at progressivism, one of the things that is very, very tempting is to look at the progressive movement of the 1880s through the 1920s through the same lens that we use to look at people who describe themselves as progressives now. That doesn't really work. And we're going to get into why. Progressivism is sort of an omnibus term to describe a series of reform reactions to the Second Industrial Revolution. So as I stated in the previous lecture, in the United States, but also in the world writ large, the Second Industrial Revolution destabilizes a lot of traditional economic relationships. It creates these novel and unwieldy cities. And so measures are taken largely by the new middle class, what Marx calls the bourgeoisie, to mitigate the impacts of the Second Industrial Revolution. And so in the United States, you don't want to think of them as a single movement. You want to think of them as a coalition of movements or a coalition of players. So I've divided them kind of into three sorts. We have the good governance folks, we've got the feminists, and then we've got labor. Labor doesn't really fit with the rest of progressivism, and I'm going to get into why in a moment. I actually want to speak to feminism first. So your feminist progressives are typically advocating for greater degrees of liberty for women. Typically, these are middle-class women who have found themselves disaffected politically, especially with the expansion of suffrage to include African Americans and these novel immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, many of whom, as was the case with many of the novel freedmen, they don't read and write. And in the case of the Southern and Eastern immigrants, they don't practice traditional forms of Christianity that people of the white middle class are used to. And in fact, many of these Eastern Europeans and Southern and Eastern Europeans are given racial slurs, and they are not considered part of the dominant majority group. They're treated as the other. And so for those other, whether it's your Italians, your Greeks, your African Americans, have the right to vote, but here are these educated, some of them even college-educated women who don't have a say in the state. And so that offended many of their sensibilities. The other thing so in addition to the right to vote, you also have them pursuing changes in laws regarding divorce and coverture. You may, one of the things that had been a traditional English law had been when a woman marries, her property is then divested of her to her husband whilst he lives. Also embedded among the goals of the feminist movement was social change to make urban life in the United States more conducive to their own sense of aesthetic. And so that would be laws against public drunkenness, that would be temperance. Eventually, this will lead to a prohibition on alcohol writ large throughout the United States. And also you have child labor laws and public education. Again, it was offensive to people's sense of morality that children, and again, this is the think of the children mentality that we even see in our politics today, to have children laboring in deplorable conditions in factories when they should be in schools. Economically speaking, those kids their families might have benefited from their labors in the factory, but we'll get into the consequences of progressivism as we go down the road. Organized labor. Organized labor we had talked about in the previous chapter. They have a drive to try and maximize the wages of the workers. They have a drive towards worker safety. The other thing that they're trying to do is they want to remove the people who will work for less from the workforce, and that would be women and children. And so one of the things that's really quite fascinating is your organized labor folks are typically not middle class. They're typically from the working class. They're typically your rank and file plus some union bosses who might be able to get in good with the politicians. But one of the things that you've got going on is this group is trying to get women and children out of the workforce to protect their earnings. And this group is trying to get women and children out of the workforce for their sense of family values or family aesthetics. Just because they agree with the same policy doesn't mean they're driven by the same thing. And you want to actually think of these as different voting blocks. Then you have the good governance folks. These are your, we would probably call this your late 1880s liberal progressive. And so one of the things that befalls many American cities and befalls the American political machine is, well, after the Civil War, you have one-party rule for most of the North and most of the Midwest. Well, one-party rule means you don't have another party to hold people accountable. And so one of the things that you have is you have graft, you have corruption, you have patronage politics, where people who are in charge of things get their position by virtue of their connections to the powers that be, rather than actually any form of competence. In the 1880s, there will be actually a conflict within the Republican Party about whether or not to have a civil service exam, because again, you've got the one faction that's like, no, these are political appointees, this is part of political control, this is our Constitution. But there's another faction that's like, no, these jobs are decently sophisticated, and we need an objective assessment format to actually demonstrate competence before we put people in jobs. And by the way, the civil service exam comes out 1880s, persists for some jobs in the federal service even to this day. But in addition to, say, civil service reform, you also have political reforms to try and break up the elites' hold on power in this one-party structure. You have the initiative, which gives the population the ability to put things on the ballot without going through the legislature. Some states have it, some states don't. You have the referendum, where matters that the legislature votes on gets referred to the people for ratification. And then you have the recall, which is a person who has demonstrated themselves as being corrupt by vote can be removed from office by the population. Now, this is more common at the state and local level. We do not have recalls for presidents and federal politicians like congressmen and senators. You can argue that maybe we should. I'll let you, cogitate that as you will. The other thing that is really important to the good governance folks is, again, you have these novel cities where a whole bunch of people have moved in. You're talking about public sanitation, public education, assimilation of the new immigrants. So I just called it alien assimilation, C-A-N-A. See what I did there. I know some of you might be thinking of extraterrestrials. No. And then, of course, asylum reform. One of the things that you actually have coming up is reforms in prisons, schools, and asylum, all of which lock people up. Because one of the things prior to the dawn of the modern asylum and the use of those in cities is, if you have a person, by the way, these mental illnesses are not infrequent in the human species, who's a schizophrenic, or a person who was born deaf before the development of American Sign Language, this person would have to be dealt with. And so the creation of the asylum, while we think of it as really quite stark, it's kind of better than the alternatives, where you have the metaphor of the crazy uncle in the barn or in the basement. And by the way, that's better than the still worse alternative of euthanasia. But again, so you have people pushing for these, who are also pushing for women to vote to push these reforms. And so there is a general sense in the period of the 1880s through the 1920s that American society is not what it should be. And one of the things that you have to understand when you're looking at that progressive mentality, whether it's temperance, whether it's women's voting, whether it's the old abolition movement, is they're all undergirded by a religious zeal and a religious impulse. And it's predicated on a Protestant Christian notion of perfectionism and universalism. So universalism is this idea that the kingdom of God is for everyone. This is different than Calvin's doctrine of the elect, where, you know, the elect are determined by God to be saved prior to the beginning of the world. Universalism implies that all can be saved, and that this notion of perfectionism is, rather than waiting for perfection to be brought by the kingdom of God in the second coming of Christ in the New Jerusalem, rather that Christ has come to the earth, and so it is the obligation of the believer to create the kingdom of God in the here and now. And so that infuses especially the suffrage and the good governance folks with that religious zeal, and it again is part of that overarching religious purpose. Now, I had already referenced the state and local reforms. You also have the rise of a political philosophy of pragmatism. In other words, the government needs to do it because the government is the only one who can do it well, because market forces have other incentives, party boss structures have other incentives, and so you're not going to get the necessary reform for human flourishing without a more interventionist state. Here you have people being paid off by the party boss by receiving free shoes. Here we have children at play in a playground or a park. I can't tell if it's tied to a school. It probably is. Again, this is getting kids out of the workforce, and these were programs. And it's also at this point that you begin to have mandatory. One of the major progressive reforms is compulsory ed. That if you're a child of a certain number of years, typically they start educating the kids about 5 or 6. There are a number of reasons for that besides bowel and bladder control. If you have small children in your life, you know that's important. One of the features is also by 5 or 6, if your kid's going to get taken out by one of those childhood diseases, it usually occurs about there. And so the kids are sent to schools. This provides some child care relief, especially if both parents are working in the factories, but it also becomes a method of assimilation. The other instrument of assimilation, remember, these schools are informed by Protestant Christian ethics. And so many of these schools also become an instrument of indoctrination and religious indoctrination. There are some Catholic communities that have a problem with this. And so one of the reasons why you see the rise of Catholic educational markets or Catholic educational facilities in large cities is as a religious rebuke of the Protestantism being taught in the public schools. The idea of separating the church, the theology from the education at this point was seen as kind of absurd, because the nation was predicated on this idea of, oh, we're all, you know, Christian consensus here. What's a little bit of the King James Bible and a little bit of Protestant theology in your school system? Nobody gave it a second thought. We didn't really have that conversation until after World War II, 60s, 70s. Anyway, so here we have children in an industrial school. Okay, you do have in the West, as these new territories are developing, again, those governance ideas of the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. Those are very common in Western states, especially such as California. But you also have the rise of the expert culture and the professional bureaucrat through civil service exams. Here you have Jane Addams and Hull House. This is basically an immigration settlement home. Its purpose was to facilitate their assimilation into modern society. Jane Addams is also writing extensively the critique of the life that these immigrants live. Many of them, they migrate, they work like slaves in the factory, they take what money they have left, they blow it they blow it in the saloon, on booze, on women, on these vile forms of entertainment that are, again, vaudeville shows, Nickelodeons. These are forms of entertainment that people find, again, these are offensive to Christian middle-class sensibilities. And I actually want to keep going. So, women are campaigning for the right to vote, primarily, and yes, it's women trying to increase their own say in the state, but the other aspect is predicated on this idea that the women are the more moral sex and that men are the less moral sex. So again, it's this idea, it's not just that women are advocating for their own freedom from men, but rather that they're advocating to have a greater say in the states so they can be better wives, better mothers, better Christians in a better society. And right about here, I want to do, I like this one. So here we have a little broadside of as you can see, if you look at this woman, she's well dressed, she's modestly dressed, and she's taking a dig at food adulteration, meaning, this is before the Pure Food and Drug Act, which I'm going to get into when we get into the progressivism of Teddy Roosevelt. Here you have white slavery, which is what they referred to as the factory system. And here you have bribery, which was an ill of politician. And you got to read this carefully. It's graft, which is a word for greed. It's not like craft, like witchcraft. Now, the next thing I want to share with you, let's see if we can pull it up. I'm going to get out the slideshow. I'll stop my share. I'll get out the slideshow. And here we go. Maybe. Okay, here we go. I want to share screen number 1. So in the documents that we've got an article on women voting in Kansas. So one of the things that's really ironic is Declaration of Sentiments comes out of Seneca, New York, back in the 1840s. This is where a lot of people say, okay, this is the beginning of American feminism. The irony of the situation is women get the right to vote in the West before they get the right to vote in the East. And so one of the things that you run into is, so Kansas is kind of west, if you think about it. It's west of the Mississippi. And so in this article, it talks about how women voted, whether they voted with their husbands or against their husbands. So I invite you to read that. Here we have the treason of the Senate article. This again is profiling the corruption and the bribery in a Senate that had previously been elected by the state legislatures. It's in this era that you have the ratification of the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. One of the down the road consequences of the direct election of senators is, I would dare say, you look at Senate races now, because they are direct election, and that means you have to campaign all over the state, and you have to have media all over the state. I submit to you the 17th Amendment might have actually created the incentive for campaign financing issues where you have senators perpetually running for office, and that might actually, lead to the corruption we find in the late 20th or late 21st century. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea. And then this one, oh, that's Wall Street, House of Dollars. Again, this is talking about the Senate being unrepresentative of the people. And here we have Jane Addams talking about why women should vote, because there is this idea that voting is combative, that it's masculine, that politics is a blood sport for men. It's not really a thing for women. And again, the idea of citizenship was typically tied to, and previously tied to, the instruments of violence. But one of the things, and you see this in the bottom paragraph, is that if woman would fulfill her traditional responsibilities to her own children, she would educate them from the dangers of the factory. In other words, you get into this article, it is the idea that women need the vote to create the better society and to protect society from the travails of modern society. And so it's not so much in what we call with the modern progressive, where there's this linear view of history and it will happen one way or another. Rather, this reform impulse in many ways is trying to reestablish the perceived traditional norms that occurred in terms of safe children, safe families, this idea that the previous existence was safe, and that the city, which is dirty, which is mechanical, which is dangerous, is novel and it needs to be kept in check. And so one can very much see an almost reactionary quality to the progressive movement. These progressive movements are going to lead to political changes in the elites, and there is a specific set of progressive presidents and the Congresses that go with them that create the modern federal bureaucratic state. And so that is what we are going to go into in our next lecture. Thank you.